Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us on the series Cultivating STEM Education with NASA Educational Resources. In this series, we seek to discuss the benefits of interdisciplinary units devoted to science, technology, engineering, and math, as well as discuss how NASA resources can be used to advance STEM education. We will also make recommendations on strategies that can be used to successfully implement interdisciplinary units devoted to STEM education. For today's webinar, we will hear from Dr. Allan Feldman, Dr. Frank Muller-Karger, Dr. Glenn Smith, and Dr. Ping Wang as they discuss how they use NASA educational resources to unpack the phenomena of climate change.
Hello, hi, I'm Allan Feldman. I'm a professor of science education here at the University of South Florida. My work is in educating new science teachers and studying how they teach and what they teach and the development of curriculum. As someone who's involved in science education, I'm also very concerned about how science is related to the other STEM disciplines, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And one of the ways in which we can make this happen is through the use of different types of interdisciplinary units. And the example of a large-scale effort at this is a project that I have funded by the National Science Foundation to develop climate change education materials. Now, the project develops the materials, is developing the materials in the context of a marine science class that is offered in the local high schools. And marine science in itself is an interdisciplinary subject. The marine science curriculum includes biology, chemistry, oceanography, atmospheric science, a wide variety of different science topics. But it also includes different aspects of how people interact with the marine environment. So aspects of history and technology, aspects of the human impact on marine environments, and so on. So of course, a major aspect of all of that these days is how the change in the climate is affecting marine environments and how is it affecting the ways in which we, as human beings, are affected by the environment. So the curriculum has a variety of different activities and connected to different topics in marine science that are good examples of interdisciplinary units that bring together science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and use data from government agencies like NASA and NOAA. So one, for example, is a unit in which we look at the thermal expansion of water and how that's related to sea level rise. So most people, when what they know about the rising of the sea due to climate change, think of it in terms of the melting of glaciers, of ice in the Arctic and the Antarctic region, and glaciers on mountains. And it turns out that there's another important factor that affects the rising of the seas, and that is it's the expansion of the oceans due to the fact that they warm up. Water does expand as it gets heated, and that expansion can have a significant effect on the levels of the ocean, on sea level. So the way in which this unit works is that we have the students doing activity where they heat up water in a flask and measure the raising of the water, how high the water rises in the neck of the flask as the temperature increases 10 degrees at a time. So what they wind up doing is collecting numerical data, quantitative data. That data they then graph. And by making the graph, they can find the slope of the line, which is the rate of thermal expansion of water. So that's the way in which well, science and mathematics. It's connected very closely in this unit. But it doesn't end there, because then you need to be able to somehow connect the increase in volume of the water in this flask to what's happening in the real life, what's happening in the oceans. And that's where you need to get some data from agencies like NASA and NOAA. For example, we need to know the size of the oceans, we need to know the depth of the oceans, and that's the type of data that we can get from them. And by calculating the volume of the oceans that's affected by the atmospheric warming, and then using the results from the experiment where we've made the graph of the rise in water versus the temperature, you can then calculate how high the oceans will rise per degree Celsius. Okay? And then, of course, if with the kids, you want to be able to check to see whether that result that you got from taking this simple experiment being done in a classroom, simple activity being done in a classroom, how well does that connect with what is being predicted by climate scientists? So again, you need to go back to the data that's been gotten through different weather stations, tide stations, satellite telemetry, and see how well it compares. And it turns out that you get a pretty good result, that the result that the kids are able to come up with from their experiment and the mathematical analysis that they do corresponds very nicely with what climate scientists are predicting. But it doesn't end there. And the reason it doesn't end there is because then if the seas are rising, how is that affecting us as human beings? And how does that affect the technological aspects of our life, the built environment? And so it's possible to go onto the web and access computer models that show how high up the water will rise, what parts of the local region would be flooded due to different temperature rising, which is expanding the oceans, which causes the sea level to rise and then floods the local areas. So the kids are able to then take the data that they got from their experiment in the classroom, use NASA and NOAA data to be able to then use their data to predict the sea level rise per degree Celsius. Then with the computer model, they're able to actually see what the effects would be on their local area. So that's a way in which this our climate change curriculum, which is called Change, incorporates science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. There are other activities that we do also. Another one that is more biological in nature is the production or the growth of harmful algal blooms, typically what's called red tide. And red tide is caused by a variety of different factors. It's caused by warming of the seas. It's caused by the by nutrients running off from the land, going into the sea. And those two primary causes are also connected to climate change. So clearly, as the Earth is warming up, the seas are warming up, and that makes it more likely that the algae is going to grow very rapidly, have this bloom, and the nutrients are mainly fertilizer runoffs that are coming from the local environment, storms from that are another effect of climate change. Larger storms, more frequent storms, cause flooding and wash the nutrients into the sea. And so what we have the students doing there is a set of experiments where they grow algae in the classroom. And they grow algae under a variety of different circumstances. They try putting additional nutrient, more higher temperature, um, additional light or less light, and see what happens to the algae growth. And of course, here again, we have the need to really include all aspects of the STEM disciplines. There's a biology that's related to the growth of the algae. There's the mathematics that is needed to analyze the amount of algae that's produced, and also keeping track of how the variables are being changed. Um, there's the technology and engineering aspects of it have to do with, well, how do human activities contribute to the productions of these algae blooms? So what if you want to do things like this in your classroom? Well, there are a lot of different sources that you can go to. There are a lot of materials on the web already. You can access the materials from our project if you'd like to. It's really very helpful if you can make some sort of collaboration with scientists or mathematicians or engineers in your local area. So if you have a university nearby, if you're dealing with issues like stormwater or weather or nutrients, there are local government agencies like the Stormwater Department, the Parks and Recreation, different experts who can come and you can collaborate with, and they can help you learn what you need to know, and they can also interact with the students. When we develop our materials for climate change education, one of the sites that we use on the web is climate.gov. Climate.gov is part of NOAA, but it also includes, in addition to NOAA information and data from the other government agencies, including NASA. And as you can see on this website, it has a variety of different tabs here: news and features, maps and data, teaching climate, and supporting decisions. If we scroll down just a little bit here, you can see the global climate dashboard. And here we have the global average temperature, carbon dioxide, and the spring snow cover. And these three graphs, when looked at together, show how the increase in carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, is correlated with the rising temperature. And as the temperature of the Earth, the global average, increases, the amount of snow that's left in the Arctic and Antarctic regions and in tops of mountains and glaciers during the time when they normally melt is lower and lower. So there's less ice and snow. So this is very clear information that can be shown to students. You can also click on this, and the climate variability, the effects of El Nino, what happens in the Arctic and what happens in the North Atlantic, and climate projections, which I was talking about before, in terms of sea level rise or temperature. This one is a change in temperature over time. The site, I scroll back up, go to Teaching Climate, has a tremendous amount of resources that can be used for teaching different aspects of climate science. Some of them are going to be draw on the types of data that NASA and NOAA can provide. So, for example, the nature of climate science.
Okay, well, my perspective is that because my particular field is Earth sciences, so obviously the NASA's resources very useful, and of course, I would think it's extremely beneficial to have this interdisciplinary units, and because my field of research is more of interdisciplinary, relating to science, technology, and mathematics. So, to what extent do I promote STEM with my instructional practice and research? Uh, well, my particular field is STEM and earth sciences. I guess I'm falling into the category of science, and for I look at the webinar, I look at the information that's on the website, on the NASA's website. A lot of it is related to climate change, which is very closely related to part of my research. So my field link almost directly to the website of the NASA resources that's being listed, particularly relating to the climate change portion of it. So how can NASA resources be used to advance STEM education? I think it's really important because these are really cutting edge measurement that they're doing, and to me it's very important. Although the resources is somewhat simplified for educational purposes, but the resource is really cutting edge in that these are the very new data. For example, I just got on the website, they're talking about the recent launch of the very specialized satellite to study various kind of things to measure, for example, CO2, carbon dioxide from space. What instructional strategy can be used to promote STEM education? And well, I'm not. I guess my interpretation of instructional strategy, I guess, would be really to work with teachers, to work with my recent experience with researchers at the College of Education really helped me. So the data and the information was put together, simplified, and explained for students and educator. However, I think if you know some of the educators, if the teachers can incorporate part of that information into the curriculum, into their classes, and that's important. Working with teacher more specifically to link to a specific curriculum would be important, and that's obtained from my recent research with the College of Education researchers on climate change. So we basically grab all sorts of information from resources like NASA's resources and from NOAA also, and to kind of combine it to kind of mesh with the curriculum I think that's easier for the teachers to use, and maybe give students incentive to kind of study, and because related to their class. And this information is really used to supplement and also provide like a cutting edge knowledge, and also provide really advanced applications of the knowledge that I'm teaching. And for K-12 level, I guess it provide some realistic information. Provide for this particular site, it has some really nice photos, photos from space. I think that will draw students' interest and help them to kind of understand information that's gathered from today's technology.
Well, nowadays it's impossible to do anything on your own. So you have to work in an interdisciplinary fashion, and by that I mean not just the standard STEM disciplines that we're familiar with, but also expanding that to the human dimension, working with economists and people that do social work and politicians. So people that actually have a way to apply the knowledge that we gain through science and engineering to the solution of people problems. So Uh, I think it's very critical. We all, as scientists nowadays, train our students to be aware of different scientific disciplines, but also understand a little bit about policy. So, if we are biologists, we need to understand a little bit about the physics and vice versa. And so, this is very, very important in today's world. Well, we promote STEM in interdisciplinary uh, efforts in everything that we do. For example, with my graduate students, they are involved in projects that have a lot of linkages with other people and other groups. For example, we manage time series in oceanography, and these time series are to observe things like carbon cycling and nitrogen cycling and the sequential uh, uh, evolution of phytoplankton communities. But we need to understand how the water moves, where the nutrients come from, how the plants and algae themselves modify the nutrient cycles in the water. So there's a lot of biogeochemistry. So, uh, and then ultimately, why is this important to people? How does it solve a problem? So we promote interdisciplinarity in every single student that we have. So that's just with my graduate students. But we also do that with, for example, teachers. So when we work with teachers at middle and high school, and we do a lot of that here locally, we bring those dimensions also into their thinking, and we try to make connections between physics and the chemistry and biology and geology. Ultimately, when we work with people in the community, like planners, uh, people in our city management offices, we try to make those linkages again to understand the problem that they have to solve and then apply some of the science in solving those problems. Well, NASA has incredible technology and it's just spectacular. And so it's relatively easy to get examples on how you can have engineering and technology to do the newest science way out there in places that humans have never reached, or to see things that we have never been able to see. So it's a way to get examples of the really amazing things that humans can do to look at the planet or to solve problems or to look at the universe. So because we can use those examples that are so attractive and so interesting, we can help people understand that science is something that you can do on a daily basis in our regular daily lives. We all uh, pose questions, even if we are not conscious about it. We collect data from the environment, and then we make a decision. And crossing the street or frying an egg is a scientific process, even if we don't think about it that way. So, using NASA technologies, we can give examples that help people explain that science is not really something mysterious, or that scientists are not these crazy people that live in their own little world. So we are all part of this world, and we can solve problems using the scientific method, using NASA technologies and many other technologies. Well, we use a lot of NASA data, but we also use data from other space agencies, including NOAA and some international agencies like the European Space Agency or the Japanese Space Agency. Specifically with NASA satellites, in fact, here on campus we have a couple of antennas that collect data from satellites that fly overhead us every day, several times a day. Uh, One of them are the Terra and Aqua satellites. So these are two satellites that we collect data from routinely. We also collect data from several of the NOAA polar orbiters. So these machines fly over the poles. They have cameras on them to measure the infrared uh, radiation that is emitted by the planet, and also the colors that are reflected, so light reflected by water and land. And so, for example, we use the infrared radiation measurements to estimate the temperature of the surface waters of the ocean, and we do that routinely. These cameras can take a picture of the Gulf of Mexico in a couple of minutes, for example. So then we can see the satellites as they start flying over the Caribbean Sea, and as they fly over the Gulf of Mexico, all the way through as they fly along the east coast of the U.S. So we can get several times a day, we can get measurements of the temperature of surface waters. And with that, we can see currents. We can see eddies. We can see things like the loop current and its eddies. We can see things that how they move in time. So because we can see that several times a day, we can animate them and we can understand how they change over the seasonal basis. And we've been collecting these data for now well over 25 years. So we have an enormous amount of information on how things change over short periods, like daily to weekly, to very long terms, like decades. And so we can see how, in fact, the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico have been warming. It's very, very clear. When we measure the color of the water, we look at the same regions, the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico. We can see things that are very spectacular, like the Amazon and the Orinoco or the Mississippi River plumes as they empty into the ocean have a big trace in color, and so we can see that, we see where the water goes. We can see red tides. Red tides are phytoplankton blooms that are very colorful, and so we can see where they occur and how they move. We can see how they evolve and ultimately understand if they reach a beach, where along Florida, for example, they may be. We can see other types of phytoplankton blooms, but we can also see other types of things, like the changes in the color of the water are very meaningful in terms of water quality observations. So we can say simple things like, is the water turbid or not, and then try to understand why. Is it because of tides or because of the wind or because of some input from a river that was turbid? So we can do a lot of these things, and the most interesting thing is looking at these processes as they change in time, because we can tell a story, and sometimes that story is very relevant to human societies. I think that the most important thing in promoting the idea that STEM is not something mysterious or something that is inapproachable is to make linkages with people that work in STEM disciplines and bring them into the classroom. So that I think is an important step. Demystifying science, demystifying engineering is really critical. For many reasons. One is that you can have people that can answer simple or even complex questions directly without having to go through an interpreter. And I think many scientists are ready and prepared and very willing to do that. You demystify and you bring scientists to the human level, which is something that we really need to do for people to understand what STEM is all about. And so not everybody has to be a scientist or an engineer, but we need to work with scientists and engineers to solve problems and be comfortable with people that solve these problems. I think that is a critical element of that is reaching out to the science community and bringing them into the classroom or into the teaching setting, so that working hand in hand between the students, the teachers, the scientists, the engineers, the mathematicians, working together to illustrate what these disciplines can do together. I think that that's probably at the core of a successful teaching program.
I would say that interdisciplinary units are extremely valuable, because if you think about the way that knowledge is organized in people's brains, it's not in buckets, it's not in little silos according to math in one location and science in another location and stories or language arts in another location. People's knowledge is all interconnected, and so by learning things in interdisciplinary units, you are making those connections between disciplines, which really is the way people think and the way their knowledge and brains are oriented. So it's much more natural. So I'm trying to bring the nature back to our formal learning by reconnecting everything back together, if you will. Let me add on to that addendum, and the way that I'm doing it is in my research is I'm embedding computer games in text stories, and in a lot of cases, we're actually doing it with STEM, and that leads naturally to the next question: is to what extent do you promote STEM in your own instructional practices and research? And I guess the primary way I'm doing that right now is the principal investigator on a National Science Foundation funded grant called Change, which operates to provide some rather novel ways for high school students to learn about climate change science. It turns out that climate change science is quite a challenge for all people, but especially for high school students, because first of all, it's a little bit, the major effects are a little bit farther into the future, so it doesn't immediately impact people's day-to-day lives. So a high school student struggling to graduate, thinking about their boyfriend or girlfriend and their friends and who's popular and who isn't, is not going to be so interested in what's going to happen 50 years from now. Another reason that climate change is tough is because the science is rather, again, actually interdisciplinary and complicated, and scientists kind of know the general things, but predicting the precise things is a little bit harder. So in this grant that I spoke of, the Change Grant, we are working with marine sciences courses in high schools in Hillsborough County, and we're making it more accessible to these high school students by making it local, focusing on local effects in Tampa Bay and contextualizing it with hands-on activities, but also with stories, short stories with computer games embedded in them. So it's a very 21st century approach to media, where we're bringing across some of the scientific principles actually in games, and also with stories that students can relate to, because it's actually the Tampa Bay area. What I would suggest is that NASA resources are kind of often there's a lot of data in them, and so there's all kinds of data, but if you think about any kind of data that can be visualized graphically, and a nice example might be satellite imagery, can be used in computer games. So for young people, it's speaking to them in their own medium, in their own media universe, to put things in computer games. So why not take some of this highly visual data? Actually, it only becomes visual after you visualize it, but and put that into interactive games and tools. Well, I kind of advocate for thematic interdisciplinary units, which use a variety of media to approach the same theme from different angles. So again, if you think about how knowledge is interconnected, then if you have a unit about hurricanes that has hands-on activities, maybe you could, for example, have a pan of water, and you have students make little islands with sand, and then you have a hair blower simulating storm surge. You promote hands-on learning. Some people learn best when they're enacting something, when they're doing something with their hands. You can also include in the same unit stories, computer games, have students do presentations or do inquiry activities. So if you weave a lot of different modalities together in the same unit, working on the same theme, you get a very powerful effect, which is much more than those individual activities or individual modalities in isolation. So essentially you add things together and you get more than what you've added together. What would I say to somebody who's going to create these kind of interdisciplinary units for STEM? I would say that you should be prepared to learn a lot about and within other disciplines, and that you need to take the time to do that, because whatever your specialty is, when you do this kind of an interdisciplinary unit, you're going to be working with people in other areas and with content in other areas which you yourself are not familiar with. So this is a kind of an exciting process, but also it takes a little bit of time, and you need to extend yourself, and you also need to be humble and realize that you don't know everything, so you need to listen to other people a lot. It's a sizable time investment to put these kind of units together. You might compare it to making a movie, in the sense that there are people from a lot of different disciplines that are working together, and you're trying to bring it together and organize it and direct it into a kind of a cohesive whole or story that works together. So a lot of management challenges, a lot of learning of other types of content and areas. So it's very exciting and very interesting, and I think it has tremendous potential, and really is the way that people either will or should be learning in the future. This whole silos approach is kind of passé. Let's weave it all together in one fantastic, exciting story that students will love and will extend us out of our comfort zones into learning completely new things in a new way. So thank you.
The presentation today highlighted how NASA educational resources can be used to discuss climate change. The presenters provided practical instructional suggestions that can engage students with exploring the phenomena. It is hoped that the various responses enlightened you of means to cultivate STEM education with the various NASA education resources. Thank you.